Welcome to our deep dive today into women's work. It's a really compelling memoir by Megan K. Stack, and it explores, I think, the very intricate world of domestic work and motherhood and global inequality. And, the excerpts you shared with me before the show really showcase, I think, Stack's unique perspective as a journalist and a feminist who's raising her children abroad. And this journey kind of forces her to rely on the labor of other women. So to unpack all these experiences and the different viewpoints, we have the amazing expert speaker here.
I think Stack's book really delves into this reality that I think so many families depend on this domestic help. And, for her, she struggles with it. She's trying to figure out how to balance that with her feminist ideals. How does that work with her own personal choices?
I think it's fascinating how she, despite coming from this family that is steeped in feminist values, she admits at times to feeling like a 1950s housewife. And I think it just speaks to the societal pressures that women still face today, especially when they're trying to balance a demanding career and motherhood at the same time.
Right. And it's that constant tension between trying to have it all, but also the limitations of time and the fact that society still expects women to be the primary caregivers. And Stack is really, I think, it's great that she's so vulnerable in this book. She highlights this conflict that I think so many working mothers are also dealing with.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to her relationship with Xiao Li. Xiao Li is her domestic worker in Beijing. And I think Xiao Li's quiet efficiency and acceptance of some pretty difficult conditions like napping on the kitchen counter really paints this stark picture of the power dynamics that are at play in these types of arrangements.
It is, that image is so striking to me. It just highlights how imbalanced these relationships often are. The employer is looking for convenience, and sometimes that overshadows the employee's even just basic comfort. And it all ties into the societal trend that we see, which is really to erase how important domestic labor is.
Right. And Stack actually admits to feeling embarrassed initially by Xiao Li's presence in family photos, as if acknowledging that she had a domestic worker somehow took away from her own role as a mother.
It's such a great example of how we just downplay domestic work. As a society, we downplay it, If we don't acknowledge it, then we can kind of just ignore this really important role that it plays in supporting families and just lives in general. And it brings up the question, why, if we want equality, do we still undervalue this type of work that is mostly done by women, often from marginalized communities?
That's such a good point. Then there's this incident where Stack thinks that Xiao Li stole money from her, and it sparks this huge fight with her husband. And I think this incident really exposes just a lack of understanding on her part about the finances in her own household.
And we see this glimpse of this distrust that I think can really permeate these relationships. Stack is caught between financial anxiety, cultural differences, her own privilege, and I think she embodies the struggle that a lot of employers probably face but keep to themselves.
Okay, so now we see Stack's journey shift as she relocates to Delhi. And she's now with Mary and Pooja, two more domestic workers. And I think Mary's steadfast resilience and Pooja's kind of vibrant, sometimes tumultuous personality offer a contrasting look at the lives of these women who are navigating migrant work.
Mary is just this symbol of quiet strength that so many migrant workers have, especially the ones who are separated from their own children. It's just a profound sacrifice that so many people make, and especially these women, to support their families. And I think, you realize they endure unimaginable hardships.
And Pooja, on the other hand, she challenges all these preconceived notions that Stack has about domestic workers. She's this evolving person with her own desires, her own aspirations. She has a complicated personal life. She's not just an employee.
And it's a great reminder that domestic workers aren't all the same. Each person brings their own baggage, personality, struggles to these roles, and often we forget that.
Absolutely. And speaking of complexities, I think the backdrop of Delhi adds a whole other layer to Stack's story. She starts observing expats navigating surrogacy, and it just brings up all these ethical pressures about commodifying women's bodies.
Surrogacy, it's so multifaceted, and I think Stack's observations really encourage us to consider these ethical implications. Is this just families wanting children? Or is this taking advantage of vulnerable women who need money? I think we need to look at it through different lenses.
That's a good point. And then you have this juxtaposition of her pretty comfortable life inside this luxury mall with this horrific Jyoti Singh rape case that's happening outside. And I think it's this stark reminder of how vulnerable women are, especially women in domestic work.
That juxtaposition really is powerful. It shows how privilege and security are so real. While Stack is in her little bubble of safety in her affluent world, outside, the reality is that so many women are facing this constant threat of violence, especially those who are in vulnerable positions.
And then there's Pooja's story. which really brings this vulnerability to light. She's in this abusive relationship with this guy named Varun, and Stack ends up intervening and forcing him out of their servants' quarters. But even this act of trying to help is fraught with these unintended consequences.
Exactly. Mary, the other domestic worker, is so worried about what will happen. She thinks that this could ruin Pooja's reputation in their community. And I think it just goes to show that you have to be sensitive to cultural differences, and good intentions can sometimes, not work out the way you expect.
For sure. And it makes you think, where's the boundary between being an employer and being in someone's personal life? Should Stack be responsible for the well-being of her employee outside of just the work agreement? It's not an easy question to answer.
It's tough, and it's a dilemma that I think a lot of people who employ domestic workers struggle with. You want to help, but you also don't want to impose your own values on someone else.
That's true.
Yeah.
And it's not like Pooja's life just magically gets better after Varun is out of the picture. We see her dealing with loneliness, she's drinking a lot, and then she gets into another relationship that seems like it could be financially exploitative.
And this just shows you that these women's lives are complicated. It's not a simple story where an employer steps in and everything is fixed. They're making their own choices. They have agency.
Absolutely. And in the midst of all of this, Pooja goes through this amazing transformation. She challenges Stack's assumptions. She's assertive about what she needs. She even shows this kind of rebellious streak. There's this whole thing about Facebook posts of her partying in Stack's clothes.
I love that detail. It just shows that she's resilient. She's got this multifaceted personality, and it really challenges the stereotype that domestic workers are just passive. Pooja's out there adapting, evolving, finding her own way to express herself.
It's so true. And, Stack's book doesn't pretend to have easy answers to these complex social issues, but it does leave you with a profound sense of how interconnected our lives are. And it shows how global inequality really plays out in our own personal lives.
That interconnectedness is at the heart of what Stack is trying to say to us. We have to face these uncomfortable truths. We have to recognize where we fit into this whole system, and we have to try to imagine a world where work that involves caring for others is actually valued and respected the way it deserves to be.
Okay, I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground just in this first section of women's work. When we come back, we'll go deeper into Stack's time in Beijing and Delhi. We'll look closer at her relationships with these women, and we'll talk about the impact it all had on her life.
I think it's interesting how Stack talks about motherhood and how she always feels like she has to negotiate her own identity. Like, early on, she doesn't even want Xiaoli in family photos. She's worried that acknowledging that she has help somehow makes her less of a mother.
Right. It's like there's this unspoken message that the good mother has to do it all by herself, and needing help is somehow failing.
Exactly. It's this myth that mothers should just effortlessly handle everything, no problem, which is just not realistic.
And Stack is really honest about how much she's struggling. The lack of sleep, the constant anxiety, even feeling guilty about relying on another woman's labor so that she can work.
I think that honesty is what makes women's work so powerful. She's not trying to be this perfect feminist. She's wrestling with these really tough issues, and I think it helps other people do the same.
Then there's Cheng Ai, who comes after Zhao Li. She's really good at manipulating situations, playing Stack and her husband against each other, almost taking advantage of their desire to be seen as the good employers.
It just shows you that even though there's this obvious power imbalance, it's still a relationship between two people with their own motivations and wants and baggage.
When Stack moves to India, she gets this glimpse into the world of surrogacy, which obviously brings up a lot of ethical questions about using women as basically, just a means to an end, especially when they're doing it out of financial desperation.
Surrogacy is so complicated. It's not just black and white. And Stack does a good job, I think, of showing the gray areas. On one hand, you have these families who desperately want children, but then you have the potential for these women to be taken advantage of.
And she even compares it to things like the adult entertainment industry. It's almost like women's bodies are always seen as something to be consumed, whether it's for having babies or for, sex.
It's a really interesting comparison, because in both cases, you have women whose autonomy is being limited, even though I think the idea is that they're being empowered.
Then there's Delhi itself.
Yeah.
You have Stack living in this luxury mall while this horrific rape case is unfolding basically right outside her door. It's a reminder of how unsafe it can be for women, especially women like Pooja.
And it goes back to privilege. Stack has this bubble of safety because of her wealth. But outside that bubble, it's a whole different story.
And then you have Pooja's situation with this guy, Varun, who is clearly abusive. Stack intervenes, kicks him out. But even that creates a whole other set of problems.
Mary, the other domestic worker, freaks out. She's worried that Pooja's reputation will be ruined. It shows how carefully you have to tread when you're dealing with different cultures.
It makes you wonder, where do you draw the line as an employer? Are you responsible for what happens to your employee when they're not working?
It's hard to say. I think a lot of people would like to help, but you also don't want to impose your own values on someone else's life.
And even after Varun is gone, things don't get magically better for Pooja. She's lonely, she starts drinking, then she ends up in another relationship that seems pretty shady.
It's a reminder that these women have their own lives, their own struggles. It's not a simple fairy tale ending where the employer swoops in and everything is fixed.
Yeah. And yet, through it all, Pooja changes. She challenges Stack. She's not afraid to say what she needs. She even gets a little rebellious, posting pictures on Facebook of herself partying in Stack's clothes.
I love that. She's not this passive victim. She's strong, she's adapting, and she finds her own way to express herself.
I think one of the things Stack does so well is that she doesn't pretend to have the answers, but she does force you to see how all of our lives are connected. And she makes global inequality feel very, very personal.
And that's exactly the point. We can't ignore these uncomfortable realities. We all have a part to play in this, and maybe if we start seeing how our own lives are connected to other people's lives, maybe we can start to create a world where caregiving is actually valued.
It's really interesting how Stack describes seeing Xiao Li again after all this time. She goes to this apartment expecting it to be, pretty basic, but it's this luxury high-rise. There's even a piano and a live-in maid.
It totally flips her expectations, right? It makes her question everything she thought she knew about Xiao Li's life and what she thought was possible for a domestic worker.
At first, she's happy for her. She thinks Xiao Li has found this great situation. But as they talk, you realize it's not that simple.
We find out that Xiao Li is basically trapped in this gilded cage. She's working all the time, catering to this family's every whim, and she doesn't have much freedom at all.
I think the saddest part is that she's still separated from her daughter. The daughter is still living with the grandparents out in the countryside.
It really shows that even when someone moves up in the world, it doesn't mean they're happy or that their family is together. Xiao Li might have more money now, but she's paid a big price for it.
And it also shows how this hukou system in China still has such a huge impact. It keeps people from moving around freely. And it means that a lot of people who do essential work, like childcare or domestic labor, don't have access to basic services.
Right. It's like even in a country that's developing so quickly, the benefits aren't shared equally.
Xiao Li talks about working for this family, and she says it's like being a robot. She's just expected to anticipate their every need all the time.
It's dehumanizing. She's not a person anymore, just a set of tasks that need to be completed.
It's kind of ironic because Stack used to be the one interviewing people, getting their stories.
Yeah.
And now she's the one being observed and analyzed.
That role reversal is really important. It makes her see that she's part of the system that often silences domestic workers.
She even admits to being a little jealous of Xiao Li's employer, this woman who seems to have it all. A great job, a beautiful home, a seemingly perfect life.
I think a lot of women feel that way. We compare ourselves to others and we think, why can't I have that?
But then she realizes that it's not so simple. That striving for this idea of having it all can actually come with a lot of sacrifices.
Because we learn that Xiao Li's employer, even though she seems so successful, she's also dealing with loneliness and pressure.
It shows that money and status don't necessarily equal happiness.
And in a way, it shows that there are some things that all women struggle with, no matter their background. The pressure to be perfect, to do everything right, to never show weakness.
So Stack leaves Xiao Li's apartment, and she's sad, but she also seems to have this newfound determination.
I think she realizes that this isn't just about understanding other women's lives. It's also about understanding her own privilege and her responsibility to do something to change the system.
That's a really powerful message.
And I think it's especially relevant for our listeners. Stack is showing us that the choices we make in our personal lives have an impact on the world. And even small actions can make a difference.
So what can we do as individuals to challenge this system and make sure that caregiving work is valued and respected?
Well, the first step is to be aware of it, to see the work that's often hidden, to listen to the stories of domestic workers and amplify their voices.
And we can also support policies that protect their rights, make sure they're paid fairly, and have decent working conditions.
And on a personal level, I think it's about looking at our own choices, examining our own biases, and being honest about how we might be contributing to a system that devalues caregiving.
Women's work doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us a way to think about these really complex issues, and hopefully it inspires us to work together to create a better world.
It definitely makes you think. And it stays with you long after you finish reading it.
If you're looking for a book that challenges you, that makes you feel things, and that ultimately leaves you with a sense of hope, I think you should definitely read Women's Work by Megan K. Stack. It's a really important book, and I think it will resonate with our listeners. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.